Hello, I'm Larry Wilson. Please join me for this seminar segment on the Bible prophecy timeline, from creation to recreation. Today's study is part 2 of 6. Okay, we want to continue our study, and we're looking at the chart titled From Creation to Recreation, and today I'm going to focus in on from the creation of the world down to the time of the 4 kingdoms, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Grecia, and Rome. As you can see, the chart here is showing approximately 3,500 years between the creation and the Babylonian captivity, and I want to try to show you why I understand that the Jubilee calendar began in 1437 BC, and why I believe that Noah's flood occurred in 2368 BC. And of course, the time period of Babylon, beginning in around 605 BC, is historically a date that is historically accepted, widely accepted. And in the time of the Medo-Persian Empire, the fall of Babylon around 538, and then around 331 for the kingdom of Grecia to begin. But it's this time period, 3,500 years, that I would like to show you why I believe we can trust the Bible to mean exactly what it says. So I want to take you to the chart, this new chart called the Grand Week. Now, you've seen this before, and the Grand Week represents 7,000 years of sin. And so I'm not talking here about the beginning of creation. I believe that creation's date is 4014 BC, and I'm going to explain why in just a moment. But I want you to understand that this millennial week has to do with the commencement of sin and the end of sin. Now, each day in this calendar, each day of the week, represents 1,000 years. And I believe that God foreknew the existence of sin, and He predetermined how long He would let it last. So, I believe that the weekly cycle is a prophetic signpost pointing to God's larger plan. Now, let me go to the bottom of this chart, and down here at the bottom you will see the weekly template. And what I'm showing you here on the screen is that God started off with the week of 7 days, and then at the time of the Exodus, He gave Israel a week of years, 7 years, every Sabbath year. So God is using the weekly cycle as a template. And so then He gave Israel, at the time of the Exodus, a week of weeks. In other words, a week of 7 days, making 49 years. A week of 7 weeks. Each week having 7 days, so 7 times 7 makes 49 years. I believe also that God has a great week. And during this time period, each day of the week is made up of 70 weeks, or 10 Jubilee cycles, or 490 years. And of course, all of this points to the Grand Week of 70 centuries, 70 cycles of 100 years, or 7,000 years. So when we look at the big picture, we see that the Grand Week of 7,000 years, God foreknew from start to stop. And He allocated each day as 1,000 years. Now, I'd like to explain why the distance from creation, which I believe occurred in 4014 BC, and the end of the age amounts to 6,000 years. I'd like to show you how the math and how the genealogy on this happens to come about. So let's zoom in here with this study that we did in the very first seminar in this series. We know that Jesus died in AD 30. There's no other date that will meet all the specifications, the timing of the 2 Passovers, and the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 happen to make up the great day of Tuesday. So we know that the time of Hezekiah's Jubilee, and then 457 is a year of Jubilee, and going back to the time of the Exodus, we know is 1437 BC. Using the weekly template, we can easily calculate. And the interesting thing is that from the Exodus to the end of the 70th week in Daniel 9 is exactly 30 Jubilee cycles, 10, 20, 30. Each day is 10 Jubilee cycles. A Jubilee cycle is 49 years, 490 years, or 70 weeks. Now we know for sure that Jesus died in AD 30, so we understand that this forces, because of the weekly cycles, this forces the Exodus to occur in 1437 BC. 1437 BC is a Sunday year because this is a Wednesday year. You can count them forward and backward. And we know this is a year of Jubilee because this would be a year of Jubilee. Actually, it's the first year of the cycle, but it is a year that aligns with the years of Jubilee because of Hezekiah's year of Jubilee and the decree in 457 BC is a year of Jubilee. So this date in 1437 BC is very secure, very secure. Now, if we go to the Bible and we start a study on the genealogical record, we can trace back how many years it is from the Exodus here at the bottom to the time of the flood up here at the top. So let's notice how this works. From the Exodus, backing up 430 years to the birth of Jacob, there's exactly to the very day in Exodus 12:41, this is the date of Jacob's birthday. 430 years later, the Exodus took place. Now, we know that 60 years earlier, Isaac was born. 100 years earlier, Abraham was born. 130 years earlier, Terah, the father of Abraham, was born. 29 years earlier, Nahor was born. 30 years earlier, Serug was born. 32 years earlier, Ru was born. 30 years earlier, Peleg was born. 34 years earlier, Eber was born. 30 years earlier, Selah was born. 35 years earlier, Arphaxad was born. And 2 years earlier, the flood. So when we add up this total, this genealogical total, we come to 942 years. Now, we have to make an adjustment to this 942 years. We have to adjust it down by 11 years to 931 years because of inclusive counting. Inclusive counting. Let me explain. Let me demonstrate. Let's see if I can demonstrate inclusive counting for you. I'm going to put a piece of paper here on the screen. I want to explain inclusive counting and show you the problem. Let me draw a timeline, and let's put in some years. so that we can demonstrate how inclusive counting works. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, on the screen you see the span of 13 years. And I'm calling it a span because the distance between here and here would be a year, 12 months, okay? Now, let's suppose that one child is born, and when he is 3 years old, on his birthday, his brother is born. So his brother lives 3 years, and on his birthday, his brother is born. Okay, so in this scenario, you see that we have 3 full years, 3 full years, and 3 full years, so that at the end of 9 years, we have 3 brothers, all born on the same day, and it adds up to 3 plus 3 equals 9, and sure enough, the span of time is 9 years from start to finish. At the beginning of the 10th year, we start a new year. Okay, but most children aren't born on the birthday of their sibling or their parents. They're born sometime during the year. And this creates the problem and the need for inclusive counting. Let's suppose that we count this way. Let's suppose that this brother is in his 3rd year when his brother is born. Now, technically, he would be 2.5, but we're going to say he's in his 3rd year. That's the way they did in ancient times. So he's born, his brother is born at 2.5, and then his brother is in his 3rd year when his brother is born. So let's suppose that this brother is actually 2.5. Let's suppose this brother is 2.5, but it's counted as 3. And let's suppose this brother is 2.1, but it's counted as 3. Because any part of a year counts as a year. So you would say 9 years, but you can see the math doesn't add up. We're showing 7.1. In actuality. So, the way the ancients solved this problem is that they simply determined that when Adam was in his 130th year, Seth was born sometime during this year. So Seth's 1st year and Adam's 130th year are the same year. And so this means when you're counting genealogies, you can't just add up the ages and expect to have the correct totals. You have to subtract 1 year for each generation in order to create and to reach the total number of actual years. So you can see what we have here is 942 years according to the count of the genealogical record, but it has to be adjusted to 931 years. Why have I gone into all this detail? I want you to know that when we go to reach the time of the flood, we have to subtract from 1437 BC, which is a secure date, a firm date, we have to subtract 931 years, and that leads us to 2368 as the time of Noah's flood. Okay? So backing up, we can see when Jacob was born, we can calculate when Abraham was born, and the time of the flood is 931 years earlier than the Exodus. Now, getting over to the time of creation. Let's go there. Adam is 130 years old when Seth is born. Seth is 105 when Enosh is born. Enosh is 90 when Canaan is born. Canaan is 70 when Mahalalel is born. Mahalalel is 65 when Jared is born, which is 162 when Enoch is born, which is 65 when Methuselah is born, which is 187 when Lamech is born, which is 182 years old when Noah was born, and Noah was 600 years old at the time of the flood, for a total of 1,656 years, counting at face value. But in order to determine the elapsed time, we subtract 1 year for each generation, and this brings us to 1,646 years because of inclusive counting. And this is why I say that the creation date, then, counting backwards from the flood of 2368 minus 1,646 years, brings us precisely to 4014 BC, using inclusive counting. Now, if Adam and Eve were in the garden for 36 years before they sinned, then sin would begin in 3979 BC. And of course, you've guessed it, that would make 2021 the end of the 6,000 years, about 6 years from now. So if Adam and Eve were in the garden 36 years before they sinned, then sin began in 3979 BC, and so we start counting off the Sunday millennium, the Monday millennium, the Tuesday millennium, and so forth. We get down to the Sabbath millennium will begin right on time. So the creation date of 4014 BC is not just a guess. It's actually based on the genealogical record given in Scripture. And we have the genealogical record from the creation to the flood, and from the flood to the time of Jacob, and then we leap 430 years to the time of the Exodus for a total of 931 elapsed years. But it's counted as 942. But when we apply the inclusive counting, there are 11 generations here. We have to subtract 11 years. And so it's my understanding, and this is why I say that this is 3,500 years. Let's go back here. 3,500 years from creation at 4014 BC to 605 BC. I hope that makes sense to you. And the Jubilee calendar and Noah's flood are all properly included. There's no conflict with this. The Babylonian captivity begins right on time. And the four empires, 605, 538, 331, and we come down to 168 for the time of the Roman Empire. Now, over here in the time period of the Medo-Persian Empire, you see these four little red stars. 1, 2, 3, 4. Four decrees were given during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. But only one decree is given in a year of Jubilee, and that is the third one, which is given by Artaxerxes in 457 BC. And if you go back to Daniel 9 and you read how the Scripture describes the coming and the appearing of Messiah, the Bible does something quite interesting. The Bible talks about the 69 weeks as 7 plus 62. God didn't just say 69 weeks. He divided it up as a 7 plus 62 to give Israel a big clue that there would be a Jubilee cycle The decree would be given at the beginning of a Jubilee cycle, and there would be a 7, which is one Jubilee cycle, 49 years, and then there would be 7 weeks that followed. So the 7 plus 62, God divided it up this way and used this language so that when we get down to the time of the appearing of Jesus, we know exactly where the 70th week is. The 70th week began with AD 27, the Sunday year. And Christ was crucified in the middle of the week. You see, Wednesday's the middle day of the week, in AD 30. And the 2 Passovers and the sun and the moon and the calendar and all the details historical, all perfectly fit. The timing could not be more precise. And this is the last week in Jubilee cycle number 30. Now, if you recall, a Jubilee cycle looks like this. Here was the Exodus in 1437 BC, and here's the first week of 7 years, and then here's the second week, and here's the third week, here's the third Sabbath. Now, all of this time, Israel is in the wilderness, and Israel does not enter Canaan until the 41st year. 41st year. They spend full 40 years in the wilderness, and remember, they left Egypt on Nisan 15, and Passover, the morning after eating the Passover, Nisan 15, and they entered Canaan on the morning after Passover in the 41st year. And so Israel's first full year in the land of Canaan was a Sabbath year. And the parallel is interesting, is that Adam and Eve's first full day of life was a Sabbath day, a Sabbath of rest. And so Israel entered Canaan in 1397 BC, which is a Friday year. Okay? Then, because of the weekly cycle of years, each Jubilee cycle counts off 49 years. And we know that when Jesus is crucified, he's crucified at the end of Jubilee cycle number 30. The 70th week is that last week of the Jubilee cycle. Now, let's go over here and look at Jubilee cycle number 21 for just a moment before going forward. 457 BC happens to be a 50th year. That's the year of Jubilee, and it's also the first year of a new Jubilee cycle. So the Jubilee cycle, the weekly cycle, all continue without interruption, and this is the only decree where we get 7 plus 62 weeks. So there were 4 decrees to rebuild and restore Jerusalem, and of course, only number 3 aligns with the year of Jubilee. Cyrus gave a decree in 536, Darius in 519, and Artaxerxes gave 2 decrees, one in 457 and one in 445. But the only one that falls and lands in a year of Jubilee, which it has to do in order to qualify for the 7 and 62, is 457 BC, and that brings us to AD 27 at the end of 69 weeks. As the 70th week begins, Jesus appears, is baptized in the Sunday year, AD 27, in the fall of that year. And so the ministry of Jesus, contrary to what a lot of people think, the ministry of Jesus is only a little more than 2.5 years. He's baptized in the fall of 27. There's all of 28. There's all of 29. And there's just 40 or 50 days, a couple of months in AD 30 before his ascension into heaven. So the ministry of Jesus is just a little over 2.5 years. Okay. What I've done, and what this is an attempt to show, is that God, in the books of Daniel and Revelation, has given us enough detail to trace and to follow the progression of time so that we might see his purposes, so that we might see that there's an end to all things, and he is patiently and carefully working out his own plans, and understanding these plans and beholding these plans is really a wonderful thing. And this is why the Sabbath millennium is soon to occur. I'm convinced that we are living right here in the final hours of the Friday millennium. Probably less than 6 years, 5 or 6 years to go. If Adam and Eve entered the garden, if Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden because of sin in 3979 BC, then 2021 would be the close of the 6,000th year. And the Sabbath millennium would begin right on time. And this is the 1,000 years mentioned in Revelation 20. And we'll see on the chart as we discuss this more fully, we'll see how that 1,000 years fits in with what we're studying. Okay, at this point, I want to bring your attention to two other things, and then we'll close this seminar segment. On the grand week of 7,000 years, you notice the Great Week. This is where each day of the week represents 70 weeks, 10 Jubilee cycles, 490 years. And from the Exodus until the death of Jesus, and finishing out the 70th week, is exactly from 1437 to AD through AD 33, is exactly 30 Jubilee cycles. This is the time allocated to the Jews to be trustees of the gospel. But they rejected that trust. They rejected the covenant as trustees, and so the gospel went to the Gentiles. And this is the times of the Gentiles. God gave the Gentiles 40 Jubilee cycles. And during this time, we have the dark ages of the 1,260 years. The dark ages, and remember, the dark ages began in 538 and ended in 1798, when the papacy was broken. General Berthier took the Pope captive, and the Pope died in exile. This is the Dark Ages, and this is the times and half a time spoken of in Daniel chapter 7, as well as Revelation 12. You can't study apocalyptic prophecy without dealing with the time periods given. So the Great Week is made up of 7 great days, and the Jubilee calendar started at the Exodus and it ended in April of 1994. This is when the termination of the day for a year in prophecy, this is where the termination occurs, right here in 1994. And in this little space where you see that red star, this is where we are living today. Now, during this time period, there are 5 prophecies in the Bible that require day-year translation. During this time period, there are 12 prophetic time periods, but none of them use the day-year period. And then we have the final time period of 1,000 years here in Revelation 20, and the earth is desolate during the Sabbath millennium, and the saints are in heaven with Jesus, reigning with Christ, and the land will rest from the curse of sin. And then at the end of the 1,000 years, the holy city will descend, and this is where Jesus then brings an end to the sin problem and creates a new heaven and a new earth. Okay, well, now that you have some understanding on where the 3,500 years comes from and why I say that, and measuring here from creation and from the beginning of sin to the end of sin, 7,000 years, and here's half of it right here. And then we start counting down God's purposes and plans in quite a bit of amazing detail. God showing us that even though His plans take a long time sometimes to be fulfilled, He hasn't forgotten us. And His plans are marching on just steadily without delay or hesitation. Well, that brings to a close our study today, and I hope you found this part of the chart helpful. We will pick up with the at the crucifixion and continue on in our next study. Well, may God bless you, is my prayer.